Mark Changizi here with your Science Moment. Today I'm going to talk about perception and why it is, or one of many reasons why it is, that we're stuck in this death spiral, this COVID mass delusion that we've been in since March. Now, let's start with perception. Now, one of the ways that we think about perception, we scientists think about perception, is that you've got these stimuli, these things that hit your eye, and your brain tries to figure out what's the most probable thing in the world that caused those stimuli. And so this is why you perceive, particular objects out in the world, because it's the most probable thing that could possibly be that thing. It's a chair. It's the only thing that could lead to those particular stimuli. Now, in some cases, like a Necker cube, this is where you've got this ambiguous cube, and it's designed so it could be 50% it's one orientation and 50% the other. But that's not the only thing that affects how we perceive the world. Even when you have things that are, let's say, having two possibilities, and they're roughly equally probable, your brain is also wanting to determine not just what's more probable, but what's the perception that is best for me. What's the utility maximizing perception, we would say. So let's just focus on the expected utility maximizing. So let's just focus on the utility side. The utility means what's good for me versus what's bad for me. So that's often a little bit hard to tell. In the case of a Necker cube, it being oriented one way versus another doesn't seem to make much difference. There's hardly any reason to worry about it. But in fact, 20 years ago today, I published a paper with Warren Hall when I was at Duke University as a postdoc, and we asked whether it could be the case that when you're thirsty, relative to a non-thirsty person, you're biased to perceive water. This is the standard highly thirsty person in the desert who keeps seeing water mirages here and there. The idea being that in this case, he's being biased not by virtue of the probability of what he's seeing. The same probabilities should be what a non-thirsty person perceives in the desert. But because he's thirsty, he has biases in terms of what matters for him, in which case water is in great need at that moment. So what we did was we just made subjects thirsty and non-thirsty, and we had them look at these various kinds of images, which these are stereograms, and if you pause here and you fuse, if you can binocularly fuse, the very top one is unambiguously transparent. There's a transparent surface in front of a background. And the bottom one is unambiguously not transparent. The middle one, however, though, is more like a Necker cube in the sense that if you fuse and once you see it, you can see it in two different ways. You can see it as roughly 50% as at the time. You can perceive it as a smooth, transparent surface out in front of a background, or you can perceive it another way where there's no transparency at all. The idea being that if we're biased towards perceiving water when you're thirsty, then maybe you're even having a general bias to perceiving transparency because it's one of the main cues to water. Well, it turns out that when you're thirsty, indeed, thirsty people had a bias towards perceiving water or transparent surfaces relative to non-thirsty people. And what's the reason? What's the reason for this perceptual bias? Well, it's because if you perceive it as as there being water, well, then if there really is water, that's great because you needed water really badly. And if there's not, well, it's not a big deal. You didn't miss out on, you just spent a couple seconds to figure out, there's not any water, it's not a big deal. Whereas if you don't perceive that there's water, then it could turn out, if there really was water, you missed out on it. Okay? So you're biased to perceiving water, even in a 50-50 case, so it's not just about the probabilities. Now, imagine that you had a different kind of perception, a different kind of thing that when you perceive it as transparent or as water, it actually made you thirstier. Imagine such a thing. I perceive water, it makes me thirstier, and thus more likely to perceive it as water, and which makes me thirstier in a positive feedback loop. Now, even if there's no water, the fact that I perceived it mistakenly as water is going to make me thirstier and more likely to see as water and go into a feedback loop. And in fact, that's what we find for a different kind of perception, perceptions of danger. And perceptions of a pandemic is really what the point is here, but perceptions of danger like this all the time. When you're walking from your car at night let's say in a spooky, suddenly, so you're a little bit afraid, and by virtue of being a little bit afraid, you're starting to see little shadows, and you're perceiving danger, perceiving little hobgoblins there. And when you perceive a hobgoblin there mistakenly, what does it do to you? Well, it makes you more afraid, and thus more likely to perceive further dangers, which makes you more afraid. It's a positive feedback loop. Now, transparency or seeing water when you're thirsty doesn't do that, but it does for danger. So that's one big difference. But there's a second big difference that makes perception of danger, and especially infectiousness, which I'm not really going to get into that difference right now. In the case of thirst, imagine Doug over there says, "Hey, I'm thirsty," or he shows signs of thirst. That doesn't make me thirstier. But imagine Doug says, "Ah!" He's frightened of something. His fear can make me more afraid. And when I'm more afraid, I see fear. I see dangers out there. And when I see dangers, I go, "Ah!" And that makes Doug more frightened. And it goes into a positive feedback loop amongst the people in the tribe. Thirst isn't infectious in this way. Fear, however, is infectious. Fear is infectious even to oneself in a positive feedback loop. And fear is especially infectious sideways to other people. And the reason that it is, individually, by yourself, just like thirst, it may be a good idea to be biased toward perceiving danger, because if you miss out on the danger, it's very dangerous. Because you could possibly, it could really be a bear. And if it turns out not to be a bear, it's not a big deal. But the problem is with this positive feedback loop and everybody around, well, you can spend an entire day or week or months or years having a perception of danger, because this positive feedback loop keeps telling you there's perception of danger, perceived danger, but yet there was no danger at all. There was no bear. But this positive feedback loop never stops. And that's the kind of loop that we're in now.